For 60 years, the Godavari's eastern tributary in Telangana carried more plastic than fish. The locals had a saying, "If you fall in, you don't wash off." The water was black in some stretches, gray in others, and on the hottest days it smelled like the inside of a landfill. Then 3,000 ordinary people showed up on a Saturday morning with nothing but rubber gloves and trash bags, and what happened next surprised even the scientists. This is the story of the Musi River. Not the famous one from the textbooks. The one that runs through the outskirts of Hyderabad, past the villages most maps don't bother to label. The one that, by 2018, had become what researchers from Osmania University called a biologically compromised corridor, which is a careful way of saying almost nothing alive was left in it. No fish populations to speak of. Macroinvertebrate counts near zero. Riparian vegetation stripped back by decades of encroachment and dumping. 170 kilometers of dead water, and 3,000 people decided they weren't going to wait for a government program to fix it. That decision changed everything, but not in the way anyone expected. The first thing you have to understand is how a river actually dies. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in layers, over decades, and most people don't notice because each year looks almost identical to the year before it. A little more silt, a little less light through the water. A kingfisher that used to nest on the south bank that simply doesn't come back one spring. The fishermen notice first, but by then, the damage is years old. The Musi had been accumulating damage since at least the 1970s. Urban expansion pushed waste disposal closer and closer to the riverbanks. Agricultural runoff brought fertilizers and pesticides downstream. Untreated sewage from informal settlements entered the water at dozens of points. By 2010, oxygen levels in several stretches had dropped so low that even the hardiest bottom-dwelling species couldn't survive. When scientists measure a river's health, one of the key indicators they use is called the biological oxygen demand, the amount of oxygen microorganisms need to break down organic waste in the water. A healthy river runs below 3 milligrams per liter. Some sections of the Musi, by 2017, were measuring above 180. That's not a river, that's an open sewer. The data was undeniable, but data doesn't clean a river. People do. In late 2018, a loose coalition of environmental groups, college students, and local residents in Hyderabad started asking a question that sounds almost naive when you say it out loud. What would happen if we just started picking it up? Not lobbying, not filing reports, just physically removing the waste that had accumulated on the banks and in the shallower stretches. They called the first event a cleanup drive. They expected maybe 200 people. 3,000 showed up. That first Saturday, volunteers working in coordinated sections along a 1-2 kilometer stretch pulled out over 40 metric tons of solid waste. Plastic bottles, construction debris, discarded appliances, years of accumulated silt mixed with decomposing refuse. They worked from sunrise until the light ran out. Photographs from that day circulated on social media, and the before and after contrast was stark enough that news outlets in Hyderabad picked it up, then national outlets. And this is where the story stops being just about one river, because the response to those photographs triggered something. People 200 kilometers away started asking why their river wasn't being cleaned. Organizations that had been working in parallel, without coordination, began talking to each other. State environmental bodies that had drafted remediation plans years earlier and shelved them for lack of public pressure suddenly found themselves in conversations about implementation. The 3,000 people who showed up with rubber gloves had done something no report had managed to do. They made the problem visible in a way that was impossible to ignore. If a story like this gives you hope, comment the word hope so we know you're watching. But here's what most people don't hear about when they see the after photographs. The cleanup was only the beginning. And the beginning, as it turned out, was almost not enough. When you remove waste from a river system that has been degraded for 50 years, you create a temporary improvement. The water looks clearer, light penetrates further, and then, if nothing else changes, the waste comes back. The sources are still there, the runoff, the informal dumping, the sewage entry points. Within 6 months of the first cleanup event, sections of the Musi that had been cleared were showing significant recontamination. The volunteers knew this. The scientists they'd partnered with knew this. And this is the part of the story that reveals what real ecological restoration actually looks like, because the response wasn't discouragement, it was infrastructure. The The coalition began working with municipal bodies to identify the 23 primary waste entry points along the cleaned corridor. They mapped informal settlements and negotiated temporary waste collection arrangements. They planted native riparian vegetation along cleared banks, species like vetiver grass and local sedge varieties with deep root systems that stabilize soil and slow the re-entry of surface runoff. They installed basic sediment filtration barriers at 3 tributary confluences. None of this was fast. None of it was clean in the way the cleanup photographs had been. It was messy, bureaucratic, occasionally contentious work that nobody was taking photographs of. And then, roughly 18 months after that first Saturday, something changed in the water. A researcher from a local environmental monitoring group conducting a routine biological survey of the restored corridor recorded something that hadn't been documented in those stretches for more than a decade: macroinvertebrates. Specifically, the larvae of several species of aquatic insects, indicators that ecologists use to measure water quality because they can't survive in degraded conditions. Where counts had been near zero, they were now registering in the dozens per square meter sample. What happened next surprised even the scientists. 6 months after that, the first confirmed fish sightings in the northern clean sections, not large populations. Not the diverse assemblages that would have been present a century ago, but fish, returning to water that, 2 years earlier, had been classified as biologically dead. B 2022. Independent water quality assessments of the restored corridor showed biological oxygen demand levels in cleaned sections had dropped from their 2017 peaks by more than 60% in sustained measurement. Aquatic plant life was reestablishing in several stretches. Bird surveys documented the return of species that require clean water and healthy riparian vegetation, including a regional population of Indian skimmers that hadn't been consistently recorded along that section of the Musi system in roughly 25 years. 3,000 people with rubber gloves. That's how it started. But what it became was something more than a cleanup drive. It became a proof of concept. It demonstrated, in measurable, documented terms, that a river system degraded over 50 years could begin biological recovery within 2 years of sustained community intervention. Not full recovery, nobody is claiming that. The Musi still faces serious structural challenges. Sewage treatment infrastructure remains inadequate in several zones. Industrial effluent monitoring requires ongoing pressure to enforce. The work is not finished, and anyone who tells you ecological restoration is finished is selling something. But here is what is finished. The idea that ordinary people can't move the needle. That idea is dead. The 170-kilometer corridor didn't come back because a government decided it was a priority. It didn't come back because a corporation funded a flagship conservation project. It came back because 3,000 people refused to accept that a dead river was simply the way things were now. And because those 3,000 became a structure, and that structure created the conditions for biology to do what biology always tries to do when you give it the slightest opening: come back. There is a word in ecology for the process by which a damaged ecosystem begins to reassemble itself once pressure is reduced. The word is succession. It describes the sequential return of species, each wave creating conditions that make the next wave possible. Pioneer plants stabilize the soil. The stabilized soil supports insects. The insects attract birds. The birds bring seeds. The seeds become plants. The system builds on itself, slowly, until one day a researcher dips a net into water that 2 years ago held nothing, and pulls out a handful of larvae, and writes a number in a notebook that should have been impossible. That number is hope with a measurement attached to it, and it is waiting in rivers and soils and degraded coastlines on every continent, ready to begin the moment the pressure lifts. The Musi is not an anomaly. It is a template. If you believe nature still has a chance, subscribe. Your support keeps these stories coming.